Well, then let's call this meeting to order of the Town Council of Los Gatos of February 1st. If I could ask the clerk to do a roll call to start, please.
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Sayoc.
Here.
Councilmember Hudas.
Here.
Councilmember Badami.
Here.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Rennie.
Here. And next, if I could ask staff to roll our meeting attendance video.
The public is welcome to participate at Town Council meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meetings is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. At each meeting, the following expectations of civil conduct shall apply. 1. For the benefit of the entire community, the Town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the council agenda. 2. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at council meetings. 3. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at Town Council meetings. 4. All public comments at the Town Council meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. 5. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the mayor may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the council exiting the chamber. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the council would return to the chamber and the mayor would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a council meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code Section 403. These expectations of conduct also apply to meetings of all town boards, committees, and commissions.
Thank you. Next up, if I could have our town attorney give our closed session report.
Yes, prior to tonight's regular meeting, councilmen in closed session to discuss labor negotiations and to discuss 2 potential matters for litigation. No action was taken that requires reporting under the Brown Act.
Thank you. Next up will be council and manager matters. If I could start with Councilmember Sayoc, please.
Thank you. Nothing to report, just usual meeting with constituents and background work on Cities Association and Cal Cities.
Great. Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. Of interest to some of our Los Gatos residents, on the 19th, I attended the VTA Winchester Station Transit-Oriented Development Community Meeting, and their VTA talked about
recording in progress.
Talked about plans for 100% affordable housing there, putting in potentially between 75 and 135 rental units. This is something that Campbell is interested in, as they have RENA numbers of around 3,000 and they would like to use this site. But there was a great discussion and some good public interaction about what kind of pedestrian and bicycle improvements could be made and, you know, how this might be going forward. So I think for people who use the light rail, this could be helpful because adding more housing would increase transit use and might increase the frequency of this light rail that many of us use. On the 19th, I also attended the League of Women Voters California Housing webinar discussing local government land use and recent state laws, which is top of mind for all of us. On the 20th, I attended the Democracy Tent meeting in the evening, where Mayor Rennie outlined his priorities for the upcoming year. And he'd already done that at his speech, but it was good to see who was in attendance and the kinds of questions they asked. I met with some residents to talk about Los Gatos emergency preparedness. On the 26th, I attended the Silicon Valley Leadership Group webinar, Housing in Your City. And on the 26th, I also represented Los Gatos at the Santa Clara Valley Water Commission quarterly meeting. The important thing to note is, even though we've had some rain and there's discussion of the snowpack has increased, we have only moved from extreme to severe drought. So we are expected to continue conserving water. We need to be using 15 to 20% less water. That was achieved in the month of November. So we've got to keep going with that. For people that are looking at changing their landscaping, Silicon Valley Water has a page on their website that will link you to the water rebate program, where you can put in drought tolerant plants. I'm doing that in my front yard right now. We've taken the lawn out. We're not going to do any planting until we know it's going to rain again. But once you establish those plants, about 2 years, they don't need water again. So it's a good long-term move. Let's see what else. And there's a plan in place. So Silicon Valley Water is also looking at, we not only have to get water from from the rain and from the groundwater, but we really need to start recycling the water that we've got and keeping it in place. And so they're working on recycling and hoping to recharge our reservoirs by 2028, which is not tomorrow. We've still got a slog to get through with our water shortage, but we'll be getting to 2028 pretty soon, and it's good to know we have some plans in place. Let's see. Last Saturday, I actually had the privilege and joy to join Kevin Arroyo and a group of his volunteers along Los Gatos Almaden Road, kind of sponsored by the town of Los Gatos and the city of San Jose, because it's right at a junction. They're putting in along kind of a vacant stretch of the road, pollinator-friendly, drought-tolerant plantings. And so it was planting and mulching day. And we actually were able to spread mulch, a whole truckload of mulch out there, and get some little plants in there. And the plants that were put in several months ago are starting to look good. So if anybody goes along there, the goal is ultimately to have a demonstration garden where people can see what kind of native plants they could be planting in their yard, and we can be encouraging pollinators and using less water. Plus, it beautifies a really neglected strip. Let's see, and then right after that, I rode my bike over and I saw Councilmember Sayak at the Youth Commission's welcome luncheon for new residents. And there was a great representation by our police chief and several members of the police force. And it was just a really friendly, beautiful afternoon. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilmember Badami.
On October 25th, I attended the Council Policy Committee meeting and considered potential topics for the upcoming calendar year. Councilmember Sayak was appointed as Vice Chair. On January 27th, I attended two board meetings, the West Valley Clean Water and West Valley Waste Management. The purpose of both meetings was to extend virtual meetings through April. On January 28th, I met with Tony Jeans regarding concerns with the SB 9 Urgency Ordinance that we'll be hearing tonight. And I continue to have discussions with community members regarding the draft 2040 general plan and affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you. On the 19th, I worked with the Work Plan Subcommittee of the Senior Services Committee, and we got quite a bit done. We also met the following Monday as the full Senior Service Committee in advance of the strategic priorities setting session that occurred on the 25th. On the 26th, I attended the Housing in Your City session, and then I participated as an alternate in the Water Commission meeting that morning. On the 27th, I met with a representative of the museum and started the NUMU Museum and started to understand a little bit about their priorities going forward. And then in the afternoon, I participated on the board of directors for the Silicon Valley Regional Interoperability Association. That's the group that has established communications between all of the first responders in Silicon Valley. Very, very important investment. And then just kind of a fun thing, I participated in the Rotary Wine Fest on the 29th. And that brings us to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Hudes. And for myself, in addition to the Democracy Tent, I also attended the Senior Services Committee. And on 1/19, I attended the Bay Area Air Quality Management District Board meeting. I also attended on 1/25 the West Valley Mayors and Managers meeting. Our main topic of discussion was housing element processes going on in the different cities and sharing how things were actually different between the different processes. In addition, I met with several different residences on several different subjects and staff on some of those subjects, including the Senior Services Committee, SB 9, our general plan update, housing element, NUMU, and policing, and some other subjects. Next, manager matters.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. I'd like to announce that we are now recruiting for our adult commissioners. Applications are due March 25th and interviews are tentatively scheduled at 5 p.m. on April 5th. We are recruiting for our Building Board of Appeals, excuse me, our Community Health and Senior Services, our Parks Commission, our Historic Preservation Committee, and our Personnel Board. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So next up is our consent agenda, which consists of items 1 through 4. Would any member of council wish to pull an item? Councilmember Hudes.
I had a question about an item. Is it appropriate to ask that now?
Yes, let's go ahead and do that now.
Okay, and I may not need to pull, but with regard to item 4, the agreement for consultant services regarding cannabis operations. My question was, in the work plan or the agreement, was it clear that the consultant could help us advise on putting together a ballot measure that would ask the citizens whether they would like to see cannabis commercial operations in town, or is it strictly to work on a ballot measure that says, should we tax it and how much?
It's going to be completely up to the council majority as to what they want on the tax ballot, but they're prepared. I've briefed them on that issue as to they're undecided whether it be a tax measure or also a land use measure. So that's part of the work program, is to figure out what the public wants or what council wants. And as the work plan shows, they'll actually start out with meeting with each one of you individually to get a feel on what your concerns and what you'd like. So yes, but that's definitely part of it, to figure out exactly what language we want.
Okay, thank you. Then I don't have any further questions about item 4.
Okay, any other council members have a question or wish to pull an item? Councilmember Badami.
I wasn't going to pull an item, but I was going to make a comment and ask a question. I was going to wait till after verbal from the public if they wanted to talk about anything on consent, but since you asked, here I go. Item number 4, I'm not pulling the cannabis consultant services proposal, but I am registering a no vote. And on item number 1, I have a question. So the minutes, they do not include the request by council to discuss and decide the possibility of a financial impact analysis for the 2040 draft general plan. So I'm looking to confirm, is there a plan to bring this item to council and at the first available council agenda?
If I may, and the town clerk may want to join me, the discussion of the fiscal analysis occurred during strategic priorities, which will be the minutes that you'll consider for the meeting of January 25th.
Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, thank you. So seeing nobody wishing to poll, that tells me now that I have items 1 through 4 on the consent agenda, and I will open verbal communication for anybody who wishes to address us for items that are on the consent calendar, which is items 1 through 4, and you'll have 3 minutes. I see Terry Swisky, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, hand up, but he may have his hand up for something else. Okay, good, it went down. So I see no hands up for consent calendar. Thank you for making that clear. I will come back, I will close verbal communication on the consent calendar, items 1 through 4, come back to council for a motion. Council Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. I move to approve consent items 1 through 4.
Councilmember Sayak, I assume a second.
It is a second.
All right, so I will go ahead and call the question. Councilmember Sayak,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Risto,
Aye.
and Councilmember Badami, feel free to indicate a no on 4.
Yeah, so I with the no vote on 4.
Okay, and Councilmember Hudes,
Aye.
and the mayor will vote aye on all the items. So items 1 through 3 pass unanimously. Item 4 passes with a 4-1 vote, which moves us to item number 5, which is an extension of our urgency ordinance for up to a period of 10 months, 15 days to the implementation of Senate Bill 9. I will.
Actually, Mayor, you have verbal.
Oh, thank you. Rushing into the fun stuff. I'll go. Let me go back. Thank you for reminding me. I will open verbal communications for items that are not on the agenda. Again, people will have 3 minutes for that. I see 2 hands. We will start with Dr. Weissman.
Can you hear me okay now?
We can, go ahead.
Thank you. I will be the first to admit that I knew little about RENA numbers and below market rate housing until recently. But the passage of SB 9 and the formation of a state task force by the California Attorney General have changed all of that. Los Gatos doesn't have a shortage of state mandated housing. Rather, we have a shortage of state mandated below market rate housing. The Los Gatos Community Alliance is an advocate for below market rate housing. The town's 6th RENA allocation of 847 units is a huge number, even in the best of circumstances. We have had separate talks with both Harmony Park and Eden Housing to better understand the challenges that we and other communities face. From those 2 meetings, we came away disheartened with the difficulty developers and cities have to build affordable housing for the very low and low end of the housing market. We see Los Gatos' prospects of coming close to meeting our state requirements as very dim. Land is too expensive and government help is too little to make a significant dent in affordable housing. We would be foolish to ignore the possible penalties that the state can impose, including legal suits with accompanying attorney's fees, the loss of permitting authority, financial penalties, and potential court receivership. We think that it is now important for the Town Council, Planning Commission, and HEAB to hear from several professional entities, such as a developer, an affordable housing nonprofit, and possibly a land use attorney, to better understand what is facing this town and what we might be able to do to increase our affordable housing numbers. The time factor is critical here. One builder estimated that of the $1 billion in approved Measure A funds, all will be exhausted in the next 2 to 3 years, if not sooner. We thus propose that this council endorse a formal study session tonight. We think there is important information that would educate the Town Council, Planning Commission, and HEAP Committee, as well as the public, about a very complex, critical subject. We propose a study session panel to be chosen by us in consultation with staff that consists of a market rate developer, an affordable housing developer, and a land use attorney. Each panelist could make a short presentation and then entertain questions from the council, commissioners, HEAP members, and the general public. We do not get the sense of the town feeling the urgency that we think this issue deserves. The Los Gatos Community Alliance thus asks for your support for our suggestion for a February or March study session on this issue. It is time for all of the players involved here to come together and work toward a best solution.
Thank you. Any questions from council members? I don't see any, so thank you, Mr. Weissman, and we'll go to Mr. Lefago.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, and staff. I'm speaking as a 26-plus year resident of Los Gatos. Lots is happening around housing needs. And Dr. Weissman, I think, did a very good job of providing a background for all of us. In fact, he did most of what he said most of what I was going to say. So, but I do want to let you know that given our town staff and several committee and commissions are working, or let me say should be working, on the RENA numbers, the 2040 general plan housing element, it is discouraging to see many of these meetings have been recently canceled, and the continuing history of misses by our town of the targeted RENA numbers these last several cycles, especially of concern, are the missed units in the several tiers of below market rate levels of housing. And now, with new legislation, as he just pointed out, coming out of Sacramento, SB 9, SB 10, 1763, and so forth, our town needs to act as quickly as possible to protect itself, yet still achieve realistic housing numbers. Other governing bodies, such as ABAG and the developers, may be able to, but quote, by right, make decisions about how many, where, and what style, density, intensity of new construction is built in town unless we take the action now. Fortunately, there are proven tools that are available to help us with this. It is to earnestly begin work on this series of projects. I am proposing this team, the council staff, and citizens schedule a series of workshops and study sessions, as was just pointed out, with appropriate town boards and committees in attendance, and to also bring in potential below market rate developers, land use attorney, finance professionals with related below market rate developments to review requirements and all of the costs associated with these potential sites, what resource needs are required, infrastructure requirements, and the funding or subsidy sources that could be brought to bear to help us in solving this as soon as possible. Action needs to begin now. And while Sacramento should not just legislate, but assist to help with the cost recovery with their targets, they do not appear truly committed. Therefore, I propose to have a series of workshops or study sessions with some other town organizations and citizen groups, and also include regional agencies and officials in a workshop setting for all participants to help get more community ideas, gain acceptance, and then commitment to be focused on problem solving, not just complaining. Workshops are for open discussions with back and forth dialogue, and the community is asking for this now. The town needs to protect itself, yet achieve realistic housing that complements our community profile. Thank you, and I look forward to working with you for quick action as soon as possible. This month would be good. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Fago? Don't see any hands, so thank you, Mr. Fago, and I will go to Jack Van Natta.
Sorry, I didn't get the unmute button. I have it now. You can hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, and staff. What I would like to do is spend the next 2.5 minutes explaining why I think The study session involving the council, PC, the staff, HEB, and the public would be such a powerful learning discussion for everyone. The most obvious is that a planning session is focused on one subject, which will draw people interested in affordable housing. Secondly, because the meeting is open to the public, there will be no Brown Act issues and there can be interaction between the parties. We believe that by working with the town to put this study session together, we could get some top-notch talent from the affordable housing community, giving them 1.5 to 2 hours educating us. Did you know that affordable housing in Los Gatos could cost $700,000 per unit? If we have 847 units needed, that's about $600 million to build those 847 units. Regarding our plan for the study session, for panelist candidates, we would get one builder representative with a specialty in affordable housing, a land use attorney with experience in EIRs and general plans, an affordable housing financial expert, and possibly an affordable housing policy expert. The panel would have a chair to lead the discussion. We would open the session by having the panel address questions sent to them in advance from our town commissions and council. The premise of sending questions in advance is that we want the best answer possible from a panelist who does not have to ad-lib a complex answer that may take research beforehand. Secondly, we would next move the session from prearranged questions and answers to questions and answers that will arise from the first portion of the meeting as it concludes. This would give our key players from the council, PC, HEB, and staff the opportunity to ask more questions that arise from the first part of the meeting. Because setting this up will take time, we would like to know how the council feels about this as soon as possible. As you can guess, it will take time to get all schedules coordinated. I'll differ with Dr. Wiseman on one thing. He said February or March, and I would say that we would probably set this out in March or April, just due to the number of people that would be involved and getting all the schedules arranged. Are there any comments?
Any questions for Mr. Van Naden? Not seeing any. Thank you, Mr. Van Naden. Next, Patrick Mock.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. Good evening to the town council, mayor. My name is Patrick Mock. I'm a lifelong South Bay resident. I'd like to talk tonight about the 1,200 square foot building size limitation that I've become aware of with any SB 9 subdivision. So
Mr. Mock, let me ask you to hold your comments until we get to that agenda item, which will be coming up next. Right now, I'm taking comments for items not on the agenda, so I'll ask you to re-raise your hand when that item comes. All right, any other people wish to speak on items that are not SB 9, since that's the only agenda item on our left on our calendar? Seeing none, let me go to the town manager. The study session seems like a good idea to me. Could you make some comments about that?
Yes, it's actually a fantastic idea. I really appreciate the Community Alliance identifying some key players for a panel discussion. I've led these kinds of panel discussions at other conferences, and it is great to get a variety of different viewpoints, including the legal and financial. So I think it is an excellent idea. I think it's just going to come down to scheduling, and I can work with the mayor on finding a time. It's also a great idea to invite our Planning Commission and Housing Element Advisory Board to join us, as well as the broader community to join the council in this conversation. So I look forward to working with you, Mayor, on finding a time for this.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Sayak, you had questions or comment or something?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that. First, I'm in agreement that this is such a complex issue, and having the general public and community understand the various complexities, I think is a great idea. What I want to ask the town manager, perhaps, since I know that you were involved in some preliminary discussions when Cal Cities was putting together their 3-part series, I know it's not televised, but recorded, and I'm wondering if that can be made available as a intermediate learning tool for our commissioners, council members who haven't already seen it, as well as general public. What this is, it's a 3-part series where it brings all these different experts and they focus 3 different times on the different issues. And so it might provide some background while this is being planned and show how at least the regional community is trying to work together on these various issues.
Thank you. And I know that we've had some conversation with the Cal Cities, and I don't think those items are yet available. I defer to the vice mayor because I know she's had more direct communication with them.
Yes,
Let me go to the vice mayor, yeah.
Thank you, through the mayor. I have talked to them. I have access, and all of the council has access to the 3 webinars right now, but they are not yet audited for public usage. I think they needed to do some things with the chat box. And so I will follow up with them to find out when we can get the recordings that could be available to the public. But in the meantime, I do have those recordings that are for exclusive use of the council members who are not able to attend all 3. And I will get those to the town manager for distribution.
Okay, Councilmember Hudas, you had a question or point?
Yeah, no, I do think it's a great idea. I would encourage the town to work with the Community Alliance in terms of the specific people that they think might be helpful as well, so that we kind of broaden the outreach beyond the folks who are traditionally involved in our general plan and housing element work. I think they have some good ideas. Thanks.
All right, so we have a study session to plan. So next up, I will close, or I did close verbal communications, and we will go to agenda item number 5. If staff could start us off on that.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and council members. The item before you this evening is consideration of an extension of the urgency ordinance that was approved by Town Council on December 21st, 2021, for implementation of Senate Bill 9, also referenced as SB 9. The extension is for a period of 10 months and 15 days. This urgency ordinance provides a process and regulatory framework that includes local objective standards and process guidance. If not extended, the urgency ordinance will expire this Friday on February the 4th, and staff would then be implementing SB 9 without these local standards. In response to questions that we received at the December meeting, staff report includes wording on the following topics. Starting on page 2 of the staff report, we've got affordable housing, the single family residential downtown zone in relation to historic, occupancy affidavits, fire hazard mitigation, building heights, neighborhood notification, minimum unit size, floor area, grading, hillside residential, and accessory dwelling units. So each of those has a page or half a page of additional context and language for consideration. There was also an addendum and desk item report provided that included public comment that was received, as well as responses to some council member questions. Staff recommends that the Town Council adopt the extension of the urgency ordinance that's included as attachment 1 to your staff report. As the next step, the town would develop a permanent ordinance for future council consideration, consistent with any future direction received from the state. We also would welcome an identification by the Town Council of any items that should be part of that future consideration. And this concludes staff's presentation, but we'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you. So would council wish to ask any ask any questions before I go to the public for public comment? Not up. Okay, Vice Mayor.
I have a quick question. Well, this isn't a question, it's a disclosure. Are you taking those now? That I met with Tony Jeans, a builder and architect in town, for a meeting prior to this.
As long as we're doing disclosures, we'll ask other council members for their disclosures. Councilmember Badami, do you have anything to disclose?
I actually disclosed this at the beginning of the meeting under council member matters and reports.
Councilmember Sayak, anything to disclose?
Similar conversations with Mr. Jeans, as well as several neighbors that were not formal in nature, but just conversations regarding SB 9.
And Councilmember Udis, anything to disclose?
I believe I already disclosed my conversation. Thank you.
And I also had a conversation with Mr. Jeans. So seeing no other questions from council at this time, I will open up public comment. So Mr. Mock, this is a good time to raise your hand again. And we'll go with Patrick Mock to start.
And Mayor, just as a reminder, we do have the policy that since he spoke under verbal, he has 2 minutes and 39 seconds left in his time.
All right, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, not a problem with the timing. Again, my name is Patrick Mock. I'm a lifelong South Bay resident. I'd like to talk to the 1,200 square foot building size limitation that has been proposed for any SB 9 subdivision. We currently have an outstanding application for a subdivision under SB 9. I mean, in fact, it would yield two 8,000 square foot conforming lots by today's subdivision standards. However, we are very concerned about the 1,200 square foot building size limitation, which would destroy our estate planning goals. And I'll elaborate on that because we're not developers, but in fact, we're just parents, lifelong residents who simply want to build a family for our home and eventually pass each home onto one of our 2 kids. Based on the current FAR, we would be deprived of approximately 3,100 square foot of building. I mean, you can do the math pretty easily, and this would be a huge economic loss based on today's prevailing real estate prices. And so we are simply asking that the town reconsider this proposed 1,200 square foot building size limit.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Mock? I don't see any hands raised, and thank you for your patience oh wait, we do have a question from Councilmember Sack.
I do, and we'll get into these details more at the discussion, but Mr. Mock, I just want to clarify that you're aware that once you do a lot line, you have the discretion of choosing SB 9 or just developing as under our normal zoning. Were you aware of that?
I'm aware of it. Currently, right now, we're going under SB 9.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.
I don't see any other hands, so thank you, Mr. Mock, and thank you for your patience getting you at the right time there. Next up, we'll go with Andrew Faber.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much. I represent 2 local homeowners, the Wimberleys and Khosravis, who both live on Quail Hill Road, and I've written you letters on behalf of both. Each one has an existing house and a legal ADU already on their property. And in both cases, the house and the ADU have separate addresses. And in fact, in the Khosravis case, the house is on Quail Hill Road and the ADU is on Shady Lane. In fact, if you drove up the streets, you would think that these were already separate properties for their dwellings. In short, both of these owners are in a perfect position to do an SB 9 lot split, and their lots are ideally situated for it. There's a problem, though, with the ordinance because it contains a number of provisions that would prevent them from availing themselves of the lot split. The first is the problem with the HR zone. They're in the HR zone, The ordinance says that's not a single-family residential zone. By law, SB 9, it must apply to all single-family zones. HR is a residential zone. It's listed in the town code. I mean, it stands for Hillside Residential. The only residential use permitted is single-family residential. And in fact, the wording that occurs for that use, one single-family dwelling, provided that there is not more than one principal residential structure on a lot, is identical in HR, R1, and R1D. So there's no question that HR is a residential zone and should be included in the ordinance. If there are hillside or topographic problems on a given lot, those can be addressed on a case-by-case basis, but do not justify excluding all properties in the HR zone. Second problem is the size limitation that Mr. Mock was talking about. A 1,200-foot limitation makes these projects have to be 100% affordable. Your BMP ordinance is 10 to 20% affordable. There's no justification, there's no nexus study, that's not legal to say that if an owner wants to use SB 9, their penalty is that their units must be made affordable and nobody else's in the town has to be. We submit that that's an invalid provision and is not wise. It was added in the guise of requiring affordability that the town cannot require, especially for SB 9. The 50 cubic yard grading is not a problem for my clients right now, but it might be, and again, appears to be completely arbitrary. Finally, the last provision is the provision that an owner who does a lot split cannot have any ADUs. Again, that's not what state law says. State law says the city can restrict ADUs if the owner also wants ministerial house approvals and ADUs. And in that regard, we would support option 2 in the staff report. So in summary, it seems like the town is fighting with SB 9 and it's fighting with people like the Kimberleys and the Khosravis who are ideally situated to use it. And we'd like to urge the town to not have that fight. Thank you.
Let me see if there's any questions for you, Mr. Faber. I don't see any hands, but I do have a question. So this lot you described one that I think runs between Quail and Shady Lane. Can that lot be subdivided now? You described it as 2 lots. What's the zoning there now?
No, it's Hillside Residential 1. I don't believe under the current slope density formulas it could be subdivided, but it logically could be under SB 9.
So you're saying if you subdivided, it would create a non-conforming lot then that couldn't be built on?
I'm saying that you can't subdivide it now because the parcel isn't big enough under the HR1 zoning. It's an acre, it's over an acre. But under SB 9, it would be perfectly sensible to have 2 parcels, each of which would be a little more than a half acre.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from council members? I don't see any, so thank you, Mr. Faber. Next up, and again, I'm having trouble with this last name, Terry Sawitsky.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I just have two issues. One is that we'd like to see the 1,200 square foot limit eliminated and that the town use standard floor area ratio. That is, generally around 30 to 35%. It's worked for the town and it makes sense to use that on SB 9 lots. Secondly, the other issue of the grading, 50 cubic yards of grading is very minimal. If you had an 8,000 square foot lot and you spread 2 inches of mulch across the entire lot, that would be 50 cubic yards. This is an extreme restriction, and I think it doesn't make any sense to penalize someone that's going to have to do limited grading once they have created a new lot. And I'm not clear how the two are associated. The drawing of a new lot line really doesn't have anything to do with the grading on the site. And those are my comments. Thank you.
I don't see any questions for you, so thank you. Next up, Don Wimberly.
Good evening, Mayor Rennie and Town Council members. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. To begin, let me say, after listening to tonight's oral arguments or oral comments, I'd like to start by acknowledging the enormous amount of work that you and staff have to address. There are an awful lot of good ideas and important issues out there, so I commend you and thank you for your hard work. As we said in our letter, our supplemental email, and as Mr. Faber has said on our behalf, we respectfully request that the council revise urgency ordinance in three ways so that it would more closely conform with the original SB 9. Number one would be that you allow and include the HR zone within the urgency ordinance. Number two, that you would allow dwellings larger than 1,200 square feet in size on SB 9 lots, at least one larger size unit. And number three, that you would eliminate the prohibition of ADUs on SB 9 lots. We live in an ADU, and ADU program, as you well know, has done a great deal for additional affordable housing in Los Gatos. I'd like to briefly describe how revising Ordinance 2326 will allow creation of additional housing units needed in Los Gatos, and obviously of importance to the town and our speakers earlier tonight, will also provide affordable housing, something very important to us. We believe this kind of development is typical of what town residents can do by virtue of SB 9. With the sale of one of our new parcels and payoff of our current mortgages, which are significant, we will be able to retire on this property where we have lived for 46 years. Our lot will continue to have the existing ADU, our affordable housing. With the lot split approved, we propose to build a new 2,500 square foot single-story primary residence on the lot that we keep. With SB 9 urban lot split and the ability to build a new home alongside our current ADU, we will not need to move out of Los Gatos when I retire. And that lot will have a modestly sized home plus an affordable ADU. The other lot will still have the existing house and should have the possibility of creating an ADU if the owners so desire. In closing, we would ask you to seriously consider our requests, those that Mr. Faber has articulated, and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Council, any questions? I don't see any hands, so thank you, Mr. Wimberly. And I don't see any further hands. Now I do. Tony Jeans.
Yes, could you put up the slide that I sent in? I'd like to go through quickly 4 items that were discussed in the discussion points. First of all, Mr. Faber has brought up one. Hillside Residential should be added to the definitions. It's nothing like residential duplex, multifamily residential, or residential mobile home. I do think that the caveat that the staff suggested, which was dead-end roads must be 20 feet wide with 13 feet of height clearance, should be placed as a caveat so that properties way out have good fire access, but I don't think it should be worded quite that way. I think it could be WUI dead-end roads must meet Santa Clara Fire District access standards to width and vertical clearance, so that if the department makes changes in the future, then the town won't get out of sync. Could you move down the slide, please? Grading limitations, 50 yards. At the moment, 50 yards is nothing, as Mr. Shevchak mentioned. The town actually allows 50 yards plus cut and fill at the house. And I think you could simply add 50 yards plus cut and fill at the house and driveway, so that a driveway can be built to a house without incurring a grading violation. That would then mean you can't put tennis courts and things like that all over the place, but at least you can get to the house. Further down, please. Frontage requirement. There is a requirement that in SB 9 that a parcel has access to, provides access to, or adjoins the public right-of-way. And the provides access to allows for an easement for ingress and egress, and not just a fee title ownership. This means that flag lots will be able to get past an existing house, which may have less than 20 feet to the side to get to a rear lot. You could also, again, say that all access corridors must satisfy Santa Clara County Fire District. Thank you. Next one. Okay, so this is the big one, 1,200 feet. Several suggestions were made by staff in their dialogue in item number H. I think there is room to do a combination. I think you should allow ministerial review, which SB 9 does, and apply the 1,200 square foot limit to only the first dwelling of a 2-unit residential development.
So, Mr. Jeans, your time is up. Let me ask if council has any questions for you. I will ask a question then. I would like to understand your application of 1,200 feet. So please continue with explanation of that.
Okay. Staff suggested that the second dwelling be 1,200 feet. I'm suggesting that the first dwelling might want to be 1,200 feet. That would require a affordable design by design unit to be built on an SB 9 lot, but allow the owner to build a larger unit for the main house. So you could do a 650 square foot ADU and a large house. So that's why I think the first unit, if you want it to apply to affordable units, you have to make it first, not second. The other thing that I think was missing and the staff suggested was appropriate was allowing architecture and site review if an owner wants to maintain the architecture and site review process by building a house, talking to the neighbors, and in that instance, the second house would be ADU size constraints up to 800 square foot minimum, which is required by SB 9. So if you have those two together, I think you're getting affordable dwellings and you are also allowing people to build reasonably, like Mr. Wimberly and various other people who have been in the town for a while. You get the best of both worlds for the town. So that is my suggestion as to 1,200 foot unit.
You have a question from Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, with regard to your proposal on the 1,200 square foot, would that be accomplished by saying if 2 units are proposed, then at least 1 unit shall not exceed 1,200 square feet?
I don't think you need to say if 2 units are proposed. I think you can just flat out say the first unit has to be under 1,200. The second can be up to the FAR.
Okay,
That
thank you.
gets you your small unit as a de facto standard, as opposed to maybe getting it.
Thank you.
And Councilmember Sec, you had your hand up, but you got your question answered. I don't see any other questions from council members. So thank you, Mr. Jeans. Let me check if there's any more hands up from the public. I don't see any more hands at this time. So, yep, one more last minute hand from Arvin Krasavi.
Yes, good evening. I just want to add some more color to what Mr. Faber talked about. If you would please put up the slides that I sent earlier. So we live on Quail Hill Road, 15941 Quail Hill Road. We've been here for 12 years. Our daughter was born at the Good Sam. She went to Blossom Hill Elementary and then Fisher Middle and now Los Gatos High. So we love it here and we want to live here for a long time. Go to next page, please. So this is the lot that is on Quail Hill Road. If you go to next slide, this shows a more of a 3D picture where the main house is on Quail Hill Road on the right-hand side, and then where the ADU on the left-hand side of that box is off of Shady Lane. And I just want you to note, to make a note of the distance between the two, that is about 250 feet, and also the elevation, more than 67 feet. Go to next slide, please. So we would like to split this into two parcels of land, one for the main house and then one for the ADU unit at the bottom, like a ratio of 60-40. Go to next slide, please. And as we mentioned a few times tonight, the Hillside Residential should be also included in the single-family residential. And even though every lot is unique in its terrain and conditions and accessibility, we think that this particular lot lends itself very nicely to be subdivided. They are on separate roads. They actually have separate addresses. And they are more than 200 linear feet and 67 vertical feet apart. They provide full privacy, and there's enough land around not to disturb the environmental aspects or wildlife. And they are on independent utilities connection for sewer and water and electricity. They are protected by fire sprinklers, and they also have fire hydrants nearby, each unit. And they have gates with approved Knox box that has been signed off by the fire department. And we also would like to request the removal of the limitation of the 1,200 square feet for the sublot. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khosravi. I do have a question for you. So we're talking about extending we call it emergency ordinance for the next 10 months while we figure out what our permanent ordinance should look like. Is it important to you that the requirements be changed in the next 10 months? Or in other words, are you planning to have an application in the next 10 months, or can you wait till we have time to work out a better ordinance?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We actually would like to proceed earlier because the ADU has just been completed and it's brand new. And rather than going into a different process for the next 10 and a half months, we would like to have that opportunity to take advantage of that earlier.
Okay, thank you. That's a good answer. And I don't see any other hands up, so thank you very much. And I don't see any hands from council, so closing that one. And I don't see any other hands from the public. So I will close verbal communication on this item and come back to council for questions and motions and comments. We'll start with Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. I have some questions for staff. I think at least one of the speakers brought up the issue with the 50 cubic yards of grading, and someone even said that's somewhat arbitrary. But if I recall, that actually is a standard we have for other parcels, or, I mean, can you explain to me where this came from?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Yes, the 50 cubic yards, which does not include the footprint of the house, that is the trigger for requiring a grading permit. That's under our current code. And our code also includes a requirement that if a grading permit is required, that an architecture and site review is also required. And so we used this in the draft ordinance and was included in the adopted urgency ordinance to be consistent with the existing town code, something that would otherwise trigger a discretionary review of the architecture and site application would not be something that would be allowed under this ministerial process.
Okay, thank you. So this is to keep things consistent with what we're already doing.
Correct.
It's not more restrictive than what we have. The other question I have is Mr. Jeans brought up being allowed on a unit to use the architecture and site application process. Is there anything in the urgency code that precludes that right now?
So I'll actually let our community development director speak to that question.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. So there is nothing in the urgency ordinance that would preclude that option. If someone chose not to do a 2-unit housing development under SB 9, they could propose to do a single-family home under our architecture and site process if they can comply with all of the underlying zoning requirements, such as setbacks, coverage, things of that nature. So that option is available should someone choose not to use the SB 9 2-unit housing development process.
Thank you. Through the mayor, if I could continue.
Please.
So for a point of clarification, and maybe you can't answer this, is Mr. Jeans proposing something different than what you just described, Director Paulson? Or is this just already included that someone could make that decision? I'm just not quite understanding why he's bringing that point up.
I think he had 2 different processes, one which was a ministerial SB 9 process, but dealing with the 1,200 square foot requirement differently. In speaking with what he spoke about regarding the architecture and sites, I believe he wanted to also include the allowance for potentially an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. So we do have provisions for that. One of the caveats I would mention is that you'll all recall that actually for ADUs, we do have a 10% FAR increase. So we probably would want to address that. The current ordinance, the current urgency ordinance does not allow ADUs on new lots that are created with an urban lot split. And so those would be changes if the council is interested that we could make to the ordinance moving forward.
Okay, thank you. That's all right now.
If I could just follow up on that quickly. So if we are asking for a unit that's the first unit, say 1,200 feet or less, that could effectively be an ADU. What's the difference between calling it ADU versus just calling it a 1,200 square foot building?
Well, it's really semantics at this point. But it directly relates to the urgency ordinance. As mentioned, the urgency ordinance does not allow ADUs, so that wouldn't be possible. But someone could technically do a 2-unit housing development where one of the units is 1,200 square feet or less. And I believe Mr. Jeans is saying if there's additional FAR above 1,200, someone should be able to be allowed to build a larger unit up to that FAR that's permitted by the lot size.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you to staff for doing an excellent job of following up on a dozen or so questions that came up from myself and from the public and other council members, and giving us a framework so that we can make good decisions with the context of what other communities are doing. And so I really don't have a lot of questions, but of course I've got a few. So I wanted to ask, first of all, with regard to looking at criteria for affordable housing here, I may be of a different opinion than some folks, and particularly developers who are saying this is not about affordable housing. I don't want to go off on that at this point, but I think it very much is about creating affordable housing, both within the text and the context of the act. But there is some thought, and some communities are putting affordability categories, very low, moderate, into their ordinances, and they are requiring that either a certain percentage or certain number are built in those categories. Is there any reason why that is not legal to do that? And secondly, if it is, and we haven't got all the information, is that something that could be considered as part of our permanent ordinance that we put in place when the urgency is done?
Thank you, Council Member. I'll start, and then the town attorney may have something to add as well. We did include language from other communities on the question of affordable housing. The current language in the draft ordinance is meant to be consistent with the town's current program. So our existing BMP below market rate program is only triggered when there are 5 or more units. And so under SB 9, you'd never have more than 4 units being developed. And so it wouldn't trigger that. We did, as I said, provide some examples of what other communities are doing. And part of this also is looking to the state to see what additional direction we receive from them. But as I said, the town attorney may have something to add.
No, I think Ms. Armour hit it. We've given you other jurisdictions and what language they've done with regards to deed restrictions. This area of laws in flux. I'm sure there's going to be, advice from HCD and from the Attorney General and others. We're here to support your decision and defend your decisions, regardless of what they are. So if it's the will of the council to insert that language in, then we'll do the best to make it as legal as it can be, but it would be susceptible to a challenge, as you've heard from the various community members.
I think
Mr. Paulson wanted to jump in to help answer too, Mr. Hudis.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councilmember Hudis. I just wanted to answer your second question, which was whether or not it could be added later. The answer is yes. So when we got to the permanent ordinance, if it was found to be through either guidance from the state, as Mr. Schultz mentioned, or other guidance that we received, then we would be free to include that in a permanent.
And I think the big issue that you see is our current BMP, as Ms. Armour said, really kicks in when there's 5 units. And we certainly we don't require a deed restriction on every single home that comes in. So it's how do you show the difference? What's the findings to show that this lot is different than any other single home that wants to be developed?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Sapp.
Thank you, Mayor. Some comments and then a question of staff. I think first, let me thank, I agree, Councilmember Hudis, thank you to staff for putting so much information in this document for us. And thank you to all of those that are providing suggestive and very constructive edits to help us. So I think the lesson learned is it's very difficult to develop an emergency ordinance on the fly. And unfortunately, we were limited in how much time we had. But what I want to make sure, question to staff, process. Today, in the staff report, it says that if they're minor, we can continue as is, what we have in our attachment, but if they're substantial, then it requires going back. And so I want to ask staff what's considered substantial. At least what I'm thinking of at this point, in December, when I brought up the 1,200 limitation, what I wanted to do was tie it to an existing program. And similar to what I think Manager Armour had said is trying not to be arbitrary and looking at what existing programs and or ordinances we have in place. So I would very much like to follow our BMP program where a lot can have a home as well as an ADU of no more than 1,200. So if that's the intent, and I like Tony Jean's suggestion of the first lot being less than 1,200, is that substantial enough where it has to go back to staff review, or can that be something incorporated today based on what you've provided?
You could incorporate any of the changes you've heard into tonight's, as long as we've got specific language and know exactly the language you're looking for, we could certainly make those changes today and insert those in.
Okay, and so I'm going to then ask Director Paulson, can you point me, because you did provide, and Manager Armour, several options. Again, SB 9, you do a lot split, and then afterwards, the first home would be 1,200 or less, and then the second would go up to its FAR. Which option is that exactly, so that I could be absolutely crystal clear?
Thank you, Council Member. I would say that that is not one of the specific options that was listed in the staff report. But because the urgency ordinance already includes the limitation of no more than 1,200 square feet, we could pretty easily, with your direction, add to that a second unit would be allowed to be built up to the maximum allowed floor area.
Okay, and so that each then, just so that we're, so that I'm hearing you correctly, each lot then would be able to have a home up to FAR and essentially an ADU, a home that's no more than 1,200.
Correct. So
okay.
we would ask that any motion just include a specific listing of what those changes would be. It also looks like Community Development Director Paulson might have something to add.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Sayak. I think I just want to make the clarification that it's not 1,200 just on its own, plus up to whatever the maximum FAR for the whole lot is. We would be looking at a situation where the lot would accommodate, for instance, let's just say 3,000 square feet. So you'd have the 1,200 square foot unit, and then the remainder would be 1,800. And so you could do up to an 1,800 square foot unit. The other caveat that we'd like to get direction on, if that's the direction the council goes, is whether or not, because this would be an ADU, whether or not we're going to allow the 10% bump as is allowed in our current ADU ordinance.
Okay, thank you.
And let me follow up on that. So do we need to specify a minimum? So we're saying that not, you just gave an example where the second unit was 1,800, but I believe the minimum sits at 800. So if they built an 800 square foot unit, then they could have 2,200 square feet as the second unit. And so that's
correct.
So do we need to specify the minimum, or is it already specified?
There isn't actually a minimum size for an ADU or a unit, but we are required to allow at least the 800. So what I think Mr. Paulson was recommending was that the wording might have a maximum size for the first unit, that it be no more than the 1,200, and that a second unit, if built, would not, in combination with that first unit, that the total FAR for the property would not exceed the current FAR standards. And the question that he stated was whether there would be the 10% bump that's currently allowed for accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make sure somebody couldn't build a 200 square foot garage and call it the second unit and then have a 2,800 square foot house. Right, it's that they're set at an 800 square foot minimum.
Yes. So, Mayor, again, Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. If you're interested in setting a minimum so that does not occur, then you could say we can just simply change the language to the first unit must be between 800 and 1,200 square feet, and deal with it that way if that's the will of the council.
Let me try to understand then what you were actually saying. You were saying you really wanted to call it an ADU up to 1,200 square feet, figure out whether we allow the extra 10% on the FAR. And by calling it ADU, it sets it automatically at an 800 square foot minimum. Is that what was happening?
So I would clarify that it would not be called an accessory dwelling unit since we're talking about the first unit. but that it would be a dwelling unit. So it wouldn't just be a garage. It would be required to have a kitchen, would have to meet the building code for a dwelling unit. But we have seen dwelling units being proposed under our current accessory dwelling unit regulations that are less than 800. So it may be worth it to allow for more flexibility rather than requiring that they be at least 800 square feet.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Councilmember Hudas for more questions, comments.
Thank you. And I'm a little concerned that we're going down a path of creating a mechanism that will produce no affordable housing and only the maximum housing that could be put on a lot that today cannot be split. But I did have a question about what we're talking about with square footage. So we say 1,200. Is that really 1,200, or is that 1,200 plus a basement? And with a basement, how large can the basement be? And are there any bonuses that would be available on top of the 1,200 as well?
Thank you, Council Member. We would use the current definition of floor area ratio. At this time, it does not include below grade square footage unless there is below grade square footage below two different structures on the site, in which case the second structure's below grade square footage would count towards the maximum allowed FAR.
Actually, I'm talking about the way it's currently drafted, which is maximum of 1,200 square feet for any new units that are built under SB 9.
Correct.
What is the actual square footage of those units? That's maximum. Is below grade permitted? And are there any bonuses?
So because floor area ratio is not defined separately in the urgency ordinance, we would use the town code's definition of floor area. And so the below grade square footage would not count. But I will look to Director Paulson in case he has anything further to add.
Yeah, so just to use your example, Councilmember Hudas, we would use our existing FAR definition. So someone technically could build a 1,200 square foot unit above grade. And if it was a single story 1,200 square foot unit, they would also be allowed to have 1,200 square feet of below grade square footage, because that does not count as FAR, to your point. So that would be kind of the ultimate cap. What I believe Ms. Armour was also speaking to is, let's say someone came in and they built two 1,200 square foot units. Only one of, and the maximum FAR for that site was 2,400 square feet. Only one of those units could have below grade square footage, because we would count it on the other one and they would be exceeding their FAR, so they would not be able to do that under the 2-unit housing development for SB 9.
Okay, thank you. I had another minor question, and that is, we're excluding historic under the current definition of zone and pre-1941. And I believe there's some analysis on whether to include downtown, because its description is that it includes historic. But putting that aside, what happens if the 1941 is updated? It's been a long time since that date was settled on. And what if additional homes are considered historic, or districts are reviewed and we add to our historic inventory for the first time in about 20, 30 years? These are some recommendations from our Historic Preservation Committee. What happens to those units that would get a new designation? Are they protected as well, or does it focus on the current definition of historic?
Thank you, Councilmember. Yes. Right now, the urgency ordinance, which would only be extended for 10 months and 15 days, is using the same definition as what we have in the code. I would foresee that when this becomes a permanent part of the town code, that it would be directly referencing the definition of historic properties. And so if that section, that definition of what is historic were updated, then that would apply to this as well.
Thank you.
If I could follow up on that, maybe I misremembered. I thought I saw the definition of historical age versus district. So the pre-1941 was using a state definition. Am I misremembering that?
No, thank you, Mayor. The ordinance is making use of our definition from our code. So the state law, SB 9, does allow us to prohibit SB 9 applications, these new development applications, to be processed on historic properties. And it can use the state-defined historic properties, but it can also be using anything that's defined by our ordinance. So our local ordinance defines historic properties to include the properties within our historic districts, as well as those that are pre-1941. And so all of those are excluded from consideration under the SB 9 processes.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like the state definition of happens to match our 1941, we're allowed to change our definition.
The SB 9 regulations allow us to use our definition.
Councilmember Hudis, did you have more questions?
Yes. Question was about the if homes were subsequently, we changed that, or they were subsequently added, would they be able to be excluded from SB 9 development?
Can you clarify? Your question is whether if we added additional homes within the next 10 months to the historic register?
Or if we extend it again, and whenever we're operating this way.
I mean, yes. I mean, I'll add in, even if it was done 2 years from now, and you added additional historical districts, changed the date of them, or whatever you did, you would have the opportunity from that point forward to include those within your language of the SB 9 requirements. Obviously, the ones that were already approved, no, you're not going to be able to undo those. But anything from that point forward would be subject to the regulations, just as if you change any regulations on any other your land use. Any projects from that point forward would have to comply with the new regulations.
Right. And then I wanted to ask about the Hillside Residential, because I'm very, very concerned about the safety aspects of adding density to areas where people not only may have to escape, but likely will. It's not a matter of if, but when we're going to be faced with wildfires. So I wanted to ask about the Hillside Residential, and I'd like to understand the rationale for excluding Hillside Residential, given some of the arguments that we've heard tonight, and whether there are grounds for the town to exclude Hillside Residential.
Thank you, council member. We did initially take the recommendation or take the wording from the state law pretty literally. It states that it is single family residential that must be included in this process and allowed to go through this SB 9 processes. And so we looked at our residential zones, and we've had two that are called single family residential, one with the word downtown, and we included those in the original ordinance. There has been discussion and public comment that our Hillside Residential should also be included, and it is possible that we would in the coming months receive direction from the state and clarification as to whether that should be included or not. But at this time, our recommendation is to keep with the original ordinance, but we are happy to implement as directed by council.
Okay, thank you. So the town attorney feels that as drafted, Hillside Residential is an option that we can consider.
Yes.
Thank you.
I do have another question that it seems like to me the question of Hillside Residential may not be that simple. When I think about it, it's really about density, right? And some of the Hillside Residential is R2.5 and R5, and some of it's R1. So I don't know where you start figuring out, maybe if you're saying one unit per acre is not really residential, it's getting to be more rural-like or hillside-like. But I was curious, in our desk item today, you provided a picture of the SB9 parcel study HR parcels, but it doesn't break it out by HR1, HR 2.5, and HR 5. Is there any way, I know you can't do it easily, but sort of what percent of this is HR1, for example? Let's say we considered HR1 really part of SB9.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't have those numbers in front of me. It is most often the properties that are along the boundary of that green area from that map, because it is most often the ones adjacent to the single-family residential zones. But how many parcels are included, I don't know. However, this is definitely something that could be provided and included in the discussions as we move forward with the permanent ordinance.
Councilmember Badami?
Thank you. So back to the Hillside Residential. If staff could remind me, a lot of our land is actually in the hillsides. So can you give me just a rough approximate percentage of the land in Los Gatos compared to the other zones that are located in the hillsides in what probably is considered fire line areas for a potential wildfire?
Well, I thank you, Council Member. I don't have the land area, though you can see there that the area that's in the Hillside Residential Zone is, a good third of the area of the town within the town boundaries. I can say that our Hillside Residential Zone properties include just under 1,000 properties in that HR zone. And there are probably close to another 1,000 much smaller properties that are in the R1 zone, but also in that high fire hazard zone.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Mayor Risto?
Thank you. And I appreciate how prepared staff is for all of these questions. We have a lot. Regarding the Hillside Residential, when I look at that, I also realize that all of our hillsides essentially abut the county or Saratoga or Monte Sereno. And do we know right now what the county or Monte Sereno or Saratoga have decided regarding Hillside? Are they including it in SB9 or not?
Thank you, council members. There are a variety of different techniques that the different communities are proceeding with. I can say that they're in the county, they actually have not adopted an ordinance yet for SB9. They're just implementing it directly for any applications they receive. But they are working and are looking towards a likely ordinance for consideration in April, I believe is the timeline that they're looking at. So they're looking closely at what they can do in the hillsides, what areas are considered urban and therefore qualify for these regulations. And all of that would be part of the permanent ordinance that they're developing over the next couple of months.
And to follow on, then through the mayor, do we know what Monte Sereno or Saratoga are doing with regard to their hillside?
So I will jump in quickly. I'm trying to look currently. So Monte Sereno has a different zoning designation. All of theirs are R1, and then they have, for instance, an R18 like we do, R120 like we do, but they also have an R144, which is generally going to be their larger lots. So they may be in a different situation from what they actually call those various zones. And I will look 1 second and see if I can find that. It's not going to help. So they might be doing a different designation, and I don't have it in front of me, but as I recall, I believe Saratoga was permitting them in their hillside zones. But while the conversation continues, I'll see if I can find that as well.
Thank you.
So I'll ask a question. So while we're trying to figure this out, it seems unlikely that we want to add the HR ones tonight, since we still really don't know what we're doing, what that really impacts. But Mr. Khosravi has an HR1 property that he's interested in moving forward with. So my question was, do we, or maybe the question is how easily? I assume he could make an application, but it would need an exception granted. Is that sort of an impossible thing to happen, or is it something he could move forward on?
Thank you, Mayor. It would not be allowed through the SB9 process, through the urban lot split process, because it is ministerial. There are no exceptions allowed. It would just need to meet the regulations. And so we would not accept an application in the HR zone as currently defined in the urgency ordinance. However, he could come in and propose a subdivision through the standard process for subdivision and request a variance from the minimum lot size. Minimum lot size in the HR zones is just about 1 acre. And so he mentioned that his lot is approximately 1 acre. And so each of those would be less than the minimum required lot size.
Okay, thank you. So council, we're going to need to move towards a decision probably soon. The way I see it, we kind of have 3 options. We let the current ordinance expire. We extend the current ordinance for 10 months and 15 days or whatever the number is. Yeah, 10 months and 15 days. Or we make a modification to the current ordinance that gets extended for 10 months and 15 days. And maybe there's another option though, but I see those as our 3 options. What would you all like to do? And I'll start with Councilmember Hudas.
So I've been thinking about this quite a bit during the course of the evening, listening to testimony from a lot of people. And I'm actually thinking that our existing urgency ordinance is pretty good, and that we have time to, it doesn't appear that we have any, illegalities in it or things along those lines. And so I actually would be comfortable with extending it. If we were to get into a discussion about removing hillsides or allowing less than affordable units to go forward, I have about 6 other requirements that would be important to be accomplished. But just my initial thoughts on it.
So that's not a motion, that's just comments. Okay. Vice Mayor Aristo.
Thank you. I've been thinking about this really a lot, especially since our December 21st meeting, where I think we did make some decisions at the dais without a lot of input, including the 1,200 square foot limitation for everything built in these lot splits. And, you know, I know we have a slew of housing laws that have been coming through the last couple of years. I think we have two issues. One is a shortage of housing, and the other is a shortage of affordable housing. And I think we have a problem with both of them. And I don't view SB 9 as specifically targeting affordable housing, but more targeting the issues, you know, all the blockades that have been put just to building housing. So the biggest sticking point for me right now, I don't think I want to go toward adding Hillside Residential, although I think if our neighboring jurisdictions do allow it, and we have fire codes to make sure that nothing can be built on a road that doesn't meet fire criteria, etc., I might entertain that after this urgency ordinance is over. But the biggest thing is, I think the proposal that Mr. Jeans put forward, where when you do the split of the two units, the first one can be up to 1,200 square feet, and then the second one can use the FAR. I think that accomplishes allowing people who have been longtime residents and want to either stay in place or set up a retirement plan or allow housing for their families. This gives them a mechanism, and it also gives us the opportunity to get some smaller units, because that would be the first step. And it would encourage someone to build a smaller unit because they have the leftover square footage for their FAR. So that's where I'm leaning.
Would you like to make it a motion?
Yes, okay. I move to adopt the urgency ordinance, or continue the urgency ordinance we have, with the change being that we remove the prohibition against any units larger than 1,200 square feet. And we require that the first unit on any lot split be a maximum of 1,200 square feet, and the second unit can use the rest of the FAR.
And would you like to specify something about whether the 10% ADU adder is added?
I think to remain consistent with the ordinances we already have, that we would allow the 10%.
Okay.
That's my motion.
All right, so I have a motion. Is that motion clear to staff?
If I could just add, earlier in the conversation, there was discussion about a minimum square footage of a dwelling unit. So that way it was clear that that first unit is in fact a living unit. And I don't know if staff has, I know we've got some discussion earlier about the 800 square feet. I don't know if we would want to go any lower than that. But that's just a question for clarification based on the earlier conversation.
Thank you. I'm actually not inclined to design a unit from here. I think, especially because this is an urgency ordinance and we can see how it works out and work on our permanent ordinance, I am not inclined to state a minimum. I think for that unit, it has to have a kitchen, it has to have bathrooms, it has to have living space. But you know, my daughter just came back from living in a studio in Paris, and that was quite livable for her. So I'm actually not willing to state a minimum. It could be really affordable if it's small. So I don't want to start playing games with how somebody should live and what's affordability. But I do think that that's something we should track and look at for the permanent ordinance.
And so you did state that it needs to be livable. Does that mean that this question for staff, does that mean it needs to follow the ADU guidelines now?
We would base that on the building code, that it would comply with building code for a living unit.
Okay. And I now looking for a second for this motion, Councilmember Sack.
I'll second the motion and agree, no minimum, but have it be certified as a living unit.
Okay, Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. I will have difficulty supporting the motion because I do not think that we will get affordable housing built out of it. I know that there's been a drumbeat from developers that that SB 9 is not about affordable housing. But I want to read something into the record, which is Section 4 of the Act. The legislature finds and declares that ensuring access to affordable housing is a matter of statewide concern and not a municipal affair, as that term is used in Section 5 of Article 11 of the California Constitution. And they use that to justify why this act can proceed. It is core to SB 9. If it didn't have that justification, SB 9 could not exist. Also, I would point to the Association of Bay Area Governments, which is not exactly a friend of local control. They have a question on their fact that says, can a jurisdiction impose affordability requirements on units created via SB 9? And their answer is, there is nothing in the statute that would prohibit the imposition of objective affordability requirements. And they go on to see, however, agencies should examine the economic feasibility of any affordability requirements to ensure that urban lot splits and 2-unit developments remain economically feasible. And that, combined with remarks from Tony Atkins, who's the sponsor of the several bills, but also talks about the reason for SB 9 is to streamline the process, to help with California's housing availability on a path of inclusion so that more families can attain the California dream. If that's not about affordability, I don't know what is. And for us to proceed with this in a way that doesn't require affordable units to be built under SB 9, I think would be a grave mistake. With regard to the Hillside Residential, I think that gives us partial coverage with regard to the very high fire severity zones that we have in town. I would like to see us explore more in a longer ordinance, but for now, my main objection to the motion is that we would not be getting truly affordable units out of this as it's been proposed.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. I would hope as we move through this, we can kind of look at what kind of applications are coming in and fold this into our discussions at the housing element and at the general plan, because this may solve a lot of our missing middle. And it may be that as we're creating more, as more housing is created, and I don't know to what extent it would be, and we have smaller units integrated with this, that we may then be able to take out some of our language or redirect some of our language about missing middle housing in the general plan. So I would like to, as a side note, see if we can pursue that as we're moving forward. Thank you.
And I'll just comment that I'm not sure I followed Councilmember Hudis's logic. Our current ordinance, which I guess would be our alternative, says, our current urgency ordinance says that we will only allow units that are less than 1,200 square feet. The new one says the first unit needs to be less than 1,200 square feet. So I can't understand how our current one generates more affordable housing than our new one. Councilmember Hudis?
Well, just to explain, in our current, there would be 2 units of maximum 1,200 square feet. And in the motion, there would be 1 unit of 1,200 square feet in the case of a lot split, or in the case of a second unit. So we would be, in my mind, it would be half the number of affordable units.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? So I will remind council members, we need 4 votes to pass this. Councilmember Badami?
A question for staff, because it wasn't clear with my understanding about back to the basement. So with the motion by Vice Mayor Risto, is a basement still allowed? And secondly, did it capture Tony Jean's recommendation that he provided on January 30th? And I can read it because I'm not sure the Vice Mayor captured some of the intent of his suggestion. And that is maintaining the ANS review process with FAR limitations based on lot size as an option for the development of an urban lot. A second home would be limited by the larger of the ADU size constraints for the lot, or 800 square feet. So my question to staff, can you capture that for me?
So I'll just comment that the proposal that Mr. Jeans provided for tonight's meeting had a little different language than that previous one I think you're referencing. So it seems to me that the Vice Mayor was looking to utilize the information received and provided by Mr. Jeans this evening.
Okay, thank you. And back to the basement, is a basement allowed for these units in the lot split?
So a basement would be, basement would be allowed for one of the units. So if someone chose to do, in the example I provided earlier, let's say they do the first unit as 1,200, they technically would be allowed to do a 1,200 square foot basement. And then the second unit, which is allowed to utilize the remainder of the FAR, would not be allowed to have a basement because it would exceed the FAR.
We've modified the language so that no basement would be allowed?
No, we haven't modified the language. So I'm saying a basement could be allowed either in the 1,200 square foot or less unit, which is the first unit, or the second unit, which is the remainder of the FAR. So you could have an instance, there's obviously a number of different scenarios, but I'll provide at least 2. One is they have the 1,200 square foot, up to 1,200 square foot first unit, and they propose a cellar. For the second unit that they build, they would not be allowed to have the exemption for the cellar. So they would have to meet the FAR. And if they chose to do below grade square footage, then that would actually count as FAR, which would reduce the above grade size of the house. Alternatively, they could do the first unit up to 1,200 square feet with no below grade square footage, and then choose to build the remainder of FAR above grade for the second unit and incorporate a below grade square footage area.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, council member, were you asking for a friendly amendment to the motion to?
Well, in a way, I was wanting to know if it was possible that we could force that type of control or restriction that a basement not be allowed.
And if we call it an ADU, can there be a basement then? Does that solve the problem?
So we're utilizing our current definition of FAR, floor area ratio, which allows basements. If you have more than one dwelling unit on a property, you can only claim that exemption for below grade square footage once under one of the structures. I would defer to the town attorney, but that can be something that we can explore. I think that's probably a longer conversation at this point to see if we can impose that type of restriction above and beyond what we would allow on another single family lot. And so maybe Mr. Schultz has some.
My only reaction off the top of my head is if you're going to do that and not allow sellers, then you'd have to do it townwide and not allow it or count it as the FAR. Once the lot split, which is supposed to be a ministerial act, it's supposed to have the same rules and regulations that are allowed in other lots. And so what you're basically doing is treating lots differently. Spot zoning and other issues come to mind that I'd be concerned about. So I think if it's the policy that you're concerned about, what's the difference between this lot and the lot right next to it that's allowed to do a cellar because it wasn't a SB9 lot. So if it's overall, you don't like the cellar policy and you want to include that in the FAR calculations, then it should be done townwide as opposed to limited it just to SB9.
Well, so let me go back to the ADU. So what's trying to be achieved is that you create at least one unit that is on the more affordable side. If you build the first unit at 1,200 above and 1,200 below, now it's not very affordable anymore. And then you still have FAR left for at least 1,800 or 2,000 square foot just above land. Now you have two units, neither of which is very affordable. So the question is really, can you force one of the units to be that more affordable, that the total square footage in the house makes it so that it costs less?
And so I'll offer, again, if that's the will of the council, we can put that. This is, as was mentioned, a stopgap ordinance. Should we get guidance that that is not appropriate moving forward, or as we have further discussions, and I would just defer to the town attorney to see if that's also a path, and if not, then that's fine as well. But I just throw that out there for consideration.
Yeah, I mean, as we said from the start, it's a stopgap measure. If we received notification tomorrow from the state agencies that what we've done is not legal, then we'll be right back with you to make additional changes. So we've given you the mechanisms of all the different areas that you can do, and it's the will of the council of how they want to write this ordinance.
Okay, let me go to Councilmember Sack.
I know that, okay, a couple things. One is I don't want to overcomplicate this. I think we made that attempt in December and we ended up causing unintended consequences. So I'm perfectly comfortable with the motion as I seconded it. I think the intent is clear. We do SB9 lot split, the first home by design less than 1,200. There is the chance that someone could build a cellar, but realistically, that option, if I'm a home builder, I would keep towards the second home. And to the point that the goal of the December meeting was to build 2 affordable homes, I think we've received testimony that if there's no incentive, no homes will be built. And so I'm quite comfortable with this. I think 1 is moving us in that direction. And I think, again, I don't want to overcomplicate this as we're learning from December. If we start to build something from the dais, we could create unintended consequences. So I'd be willing to look at all of these changes for our permanent, but for now, I like what I've seconded.
Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you. I would regretfully support this if the cellars were eliminated and several other things were accomplished as well that I think are important. Otherwise, I think our existing urgency ordinance is effective and achieves a lot of objectives without undue legal pressures. What I would suggest that if we were to go ahead with this, I think it would be important to have neighbor notification, if it's legal, and I didn't think I got a clear opinion on this, but to allow appeals when staff makes exceptions, and that we would not allow the removal of large protected trees, much in the way that we do. I think our hillsides have benefited from this, and I think our other residents have benefited from that. So those are things that I think would be important to include if we go beyond what our existing ordinance is.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. Actually, Councilmember Sayak said a lot of what I was going to say, but I'm not willing at all to start entertaining whether we're going to take away basements or anything else right now. I think we can collect enough data and learn enough before we create the ordinance without starting to put undue restrictions that will cause nothing to get built whatsoever, because I don't think that is or should be our goal. And, you know, we'll see what goes forward. But I agree with Councilmember Sayak that it's quite likely anybody who's going to build that first smaller unit is going to keep the seller for the second unit, but we'll see what happens. And regarding notification, what I would like to see, if possible, I don't know if it can be incorporated immediately, but the town website does have projects pending. And if projects that are coming forward, I know that because there is no neighborhood input on these ministerial approvals, we don't want to give people the wrong idea that if they see a project coming and we notify them that they can come in and change it, or there will be a hearing, because there won't be. But I think if somebody wants to know what is happening in their neighborhood, if it's on the project pending page, then that can serve as notification, and we can make sure that we get the word out to people that this is a good way to look for things. So would that be possible to implement? That's not really part of the motion, but a request for staff to look into what it would take to put the SB9 lot splits and development on projects pending?
That's
Yes, if that's, if that's interest to council, we can definitely accomplish that.
Okay, thank you. For me, that would be a great way to allow residents to know what is happening, what is changing, without going to the expense and inconvenience of trying to mail things out or put notification out that will give people the impression this is similar to when we have a hearing and create more confusion. But I think then this would slowly evolve as a way for people to track what's happening. Thank you.
Yes, and then we also could add, we'll send out, for instance, an informational item on our social media and what's new, so that we get the word out, and maybe, do that once a month for the next few months, and then obviously link that with conversations as we develop the permanent ordinance moving.
Councilmember Hudis?
Yeah, I appreciate the creative ideas on informing the public. I don't think putting it on the website will do anything, because I don't think residents are there logging on to the town website to see if something comes up on their street. That's just not informative. And I think that there are numerous other municipalities that are doing notification. I believe that there is obviously some expense associated with it, but I think we have to balance that expense with the need for public to know when the property next door to theirs is being split, so that they can look at the application, because their eyes on it is a check and balance. Otherwise, the only check and balance is town staff, and that, to me, is not shining light on what's going on. That's, in effect, preventing people from knowing what's going on in their neighborhood. So I really don't think the town website accomplishes anything, because you'd have to be, checking it multiple times a week to see whether there was something happening in order to know that. I don't think anyone will do that.
Vice Mayor Risto?
Thank you. Well, I hope that we'll all use our channels of communication and social media to let people know. And I certainly can keep track of everything that's happening in town, checking once a week on projects pending. But, I do want to thank our staff. I know that they are our eyes of what's happening in this town. They're professionals. They work in this community. Kind of mirroring our ADU process, because that's ministerial, we do not do notifications when ADUs are being built. And so I think we have a similar situation here. And as people get an understanding that there's going to be some perhaps additional construction, they'll start tuning in, and maybe we can get the word out through next door of how people can check into things. But I feel like we already have lived with by right ADUs and have not been able to notify people, and that has moved forward. So I understand that there's a concern. It's just always hard to reach out and tell people everything they need to know, because we don't know what everything they want to know is.
Councilmember Sapp?
I'm not going to weigh in on the specifics of whether it should be this, but I do think if I could just refer this, not again in the motion, to Town Manager Rebate. I think there needs to be some sort of communication on the ministerial actions versus discretionary. I think the housing laws are now causing enough ministerial action that it behooves us to explain to our residents why there are some projects where there is no discretion, because my concern, not so much about expense is one thing, but if I said it wasn't, I think our Finance Commission would be upset. But I think there's also raising expectations. And oftentimes if we ask people to participate because their input can help constructively change the conversation. And I think we need to explain the ministerial process to our residents, that there are things that are happening that are by right now and what those are, so that those expectations can help be managed, so that as more and more of these projects come forward, we just don't create resentment and anger and lose people's, well, I don't even want to say what they're going to lose, but but just again, manage expectations. So.
Okay, so let me go ahead and call the question on this motion. I'll remind council members that it needs 4 votes to pass. So I'll start with Councilmember Sayak.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Aristo.
Aye.
Councilmember Hudas.
No.
Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
And the mayor votes aye also. I think this is an improvement from the one we have. Of course, you know, we hope to have a much better one in 10 months and 15 days. So that motion passes 4-1. Any other comments from council members or questions? Vice Mayor Aristo?
Yes, I just wanted to confirm, and you know, to your point, Mayor, you said we have an urgency ordinance for the next 10 months and 15 days. That's maximum. So I wanted to check in with staff, because I thought I had heard that potentially a new ordinance or the ordinance could be coming forward sooner than that. So I just wanted to ask about timeline and expectations and possibilities.
And that's probably dependent somewhat on more guidance from the state also, I would assume.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor. That's correct. The timing will depend somewhat on what direction we receive from the state, additional direction that they might provide. But we would be looking to start the process of developing a new ordinance in the next month or two, and would, you know, pending feedback from the state, then proceed with public outreach and working through the process potentially over the summer or into the fall. We would not be trying to hold it to the very end, because we want to make sure there is enough time to do that outreach, to do that engagement, and to have full discussion by both Planning Commission so that they can provide a recommendation, and then by Town Council for adoption.
Okay, perfect. I just didn't want to leave the impression that, you know, the next time we're going to look at this is in 10 months. So I appreciate that. It sounds like staff has a gargantuan amount of work to do with this and the general plan and the housing element, but they all relate to each other. So thank you. And I appreciate that probably starting tomorrow, you have to start getting input from the state.
All right. So with that, I will, Councilmember Hudis would like to make some more comments.
Yes, I would just like to thank the thoughtful process of my fellow council members and the community in coming to a solution that does move this forward. I am, of course, disappointed that we're not doing more to create affordable housing, because clearly SB 9 is something that is going to cause, I would say maybe not pain, but I would say certainly discomfort to many of our residents who have been here either a long time or have recently moved here and made a significant investment in selecting Los Gatos with its character and with its type of housing to move to. And that, in order to make that kind of a change and to endure that kind of challenge, I think there needs to be something in it for the town as well. And I look toward affordable housing as the other side of that ledger. And so while maybe we didn't accomplish as much I would have liked to have seen on affordable housing, I would encourage staff to continue to look at affordable housing categories, the ability to do that, and not to listen to the drumbeat of this bill is not about affordable housing. I believe if you read the text, you read the comments of the folks who supported this, it is very much about affordable housing. And so I would encourage staff to look around, continue to look around at opportunities for Los Gatos to get affordable housing as we endure the changes that the state is placing on the residents. So just a comment about going forward and what I think would be important to see in a permanent ordinance.
Okay, so if I could ask the clerk to read the ordinance by title only, please.
Thank you. An interim urgency ordinance of the Council of the Town of Los Gatos extending for a period of 10 months at 15 days, implementing Senate Bill 9 to allow for 2-unit housing developments and urban lot splits in all single-family residential zones.
All right, Mr. Hudis, your hand is still up. I assume it's down now. So with that, I will call this item over with. This is the last item on our agenda. So I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody.